Right now, somewhere high above the Earth, a satellite is watching. Its lens is focused on a remote patch of Iranian soil where something extraordinary is happening. Deep underground tunnels are being sealed shut. Mountains of fresh dirt are being piled over entrances that were visible just days ago. Massive concrete structures are appearing where none existed before. And this isn't just routine construction. This is Iran preparing for war. Every piece of dirt moved, every tunnel sealed, every concrete barrier erected tells the same urgent story. Tehran knows what's coming. The question isn't if the United States will strike again, but when. And the scale of what military planners are preparing makes last summer's devastating Operation Midnight Hammer look like a warning shot. Let me take you back to June 2025. On the night of June 21st, 7 B-2 Spirit stealth bombers lifted off from Whiteman Air Force Base in Missouri. They weren't alone. More than 125 aircraft took to the skies that night, including F-22 Raptors, F-35 Lightning fighters, dozens of refueling tankers, and a guided missile submarine prowling beneath the waves of the Middle East. But the real stars of Operation Midnight Hammer were those 7 B-2 bombers, carrying a weapon the world had never seen used in combat. The GBU-57 Massive Ordnance Penetrator, a 30,000-pound bunker-busting bomb specifically designed for one purpose, to obliterate Iran's underground nuclear facilities. For 18 hours, those B-2 bombers flew eastward. They crossed the Atlantic, refueled over Europe, crossed the Mediterranean, and finally entered the airspace of America's Middle Eastern allies. The mission required absolute precision. Every detail had been planned for months, maybe years. Meanwhile, to throw off Iranian intelligence, 2 more B-2 bombers flew west toward Guam as decoys, making the Iranians think the real strike force was headed in the opposite direction. It was military deception at its finest. At exactly 5 o'clock Eastern Time, just as the bomber strike package was about to enter Iranian airspace, a United States submarine fired more than 24 Tomahawk cruise missiles at the Isfahan nuclear facility. These weren't just any missiles. They were targeting specific surface infrastructure to soften up the defenses for what came next. Then the fighters swept in ahead of the bombers, flying at high altitude and high speed, launching AGM-88 HARM missiles at Iranian radar installations and surface-to-air missile batteries. The goal was simple: blind Iran's defenses before the main event. At 2:10 in the morning local Iranian time, the first B-2 bomber released 2 massive ordnance penetrators over Fordo. That's Iran's most heavily fortified underground nuclear facility, built deep inside a mountain specifically to withstand conventional bombing. The Iranians thought it was invulnerable. They were wrong. Over the next 25 minutes, 14 of these massive bombs rained down on Fordo and Natanz, Iran's 2 primary uranium enrichment sites. Each bomb weighed as much as a small truck and could penetrate hundreds of feet of reinforced concrete and solid rock before detonating. The explosions were cataclysmic. Here's what makes this even more remarkable. Throughout the entire operation, Iran didn't fire a single shot. Their fighter jets never left the ground. Their surface-to-air missiles never launched. Either they were already blinded by Israeli cyber operations that had preceded the American strikes, or their systems simply couldn't detect the stealth aircraft overhead, or they made the calculated decision to hold fire knowing they were completely outmatched. General Dan Kane, chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, put it bluntly at the Pentagon briefing the next day. Iran's fighters did not fly, and it appears that Iran's surface-to-air missile systems did not see us. Throughout the mission, we retained the element of surprise. The damage was catastrophic. Initial battle damage assessments indicated all 3 sites sustained extremely severe damage and destruction. President Trump declared the sites obliterated. The White House's National Security Strategy, published in November 2025, stated that the strikes significantly degraded Iran's nuclear program. It was the largest B-2 operational strike in United States history. It was also the first time America had attacked Iranian territory since a naval offensive in 1988. The message was crystal clear. The United States could reach into the heart of Iran and destroy its most protected facilities whenever it chose. But here's what many people don't understand about nuclear programs. Destruction isn't the same as elimination. You can blow up buildings, collapse tunnels, destroy centrifuges, but you can't necessarily eliminate the knowledge, the materials, or the determination of a nation that wants nuclear weapons. Iran had spent decades building its nuclear infrastructure. Before the strikes, the International Atomic Energy Agency reported that Iran had stockpiled more than 440 kilograms of uranium enriched to 60% purity. That's just below weapons grade. That's enough material for multiple nuclear weapons, if enriched further to 90%. So what happened to all that enriched uranium? Here's where it gets interesting. Days before Operation Midnight Hammer, satellite imagery showed trucks at both the Fordow and Isfahan facilities, apparently loading up and driving away. Intelligence analysts believe Iran moved at least some of its enriched uranium stockpile out of the facilities before they were hit. Where did it go? Nobody knows for certain. That's one of the most terrifying questions hanging over this entire crisis. Iran could have hidden its most valuable nuclear material in facilities that haven't been discovered yet, in civilian buildings that would be off limits to bombing, or dispersed it across dozens of small locations that would be nearly impossible to find. Now, fast forward to today, February 16, 2026. The protests that erupted in late December 2025 have changed everything. What started as demonstrations against Iran's collapsing economy turned into the largest uprising the Islamic Republic has faced since its founding in 1979. And the regime's response was beyond brutal. It was a massacre. The numbers are still emerging and they're horrifying. The Iranian government claims just over 3,000 people were killed. But independent monitors tell a very different story. The human rights activist news agency, which has a track record of accuracy in verifying deaths during Iranian protests, has documented nearly 7,000 confirmed deaths as of early February. Iran International, citing classified documents and field reports, puts the death toll from just 2 days of crackdown, January 8th and 9th, at more than 36,000 people. Let that sink in for a moment. More than 36,000 people killed in 2 days. That would make it the deadliest 2-day protest massacre in modern history. Eyewitness accounts describe scenes from hell. Security forces opening fire on crowds with automatic weapons, cutting Iran off from the outside world to hide what was happening in its streets. Those who managed to get information out described it with words like war situation, massacre, bloodbath, and apocalypse. President Trump initially threatened to intervene on behalf of the protesters. On January 2nd, just 1 day before his military operation that captured Venezuela's President Maduro, Trump threatened to come to their rescue, but he ultimately didn't. Instead, he issued a different ultimatum to Tehran: make a deal, or face military strikes that would make Operation Midnight Hammer look gentle by comparison. Trump's rhetoric has been relentless. He told Israeli media, either we reach a deal or we'll have to do something very tough. He compared Iran's situation to Venezuela's, where American special forces abducted a sitting president. He warned that the United States military is locked and loaded and ready to go. He's called the American naval presence in the region an armada. And perhaps most ominously, he told reporters that the next attack will be far worse than the June strikes. But the Trump administration isn't just threatening. Their positioning the military buildup in the Middle East over the past month is staggering. The USS Abraham Lincoln Carrier Strike Group is already in the region, bringing with it dozens of fighter jets, Tomahawk cruise missiles, and thousands of sailors and Marines. Trump has now told reporters he's considering sending a second aircraft carrier strike group to join it. That would likely be the USS Gerald R. Ford, one of America's newest and most capable carriers. Satellite imagery captured in late January and early February shows a dramatic increase in American military hardware at bases throughout the region. Al Udeid Air Base in Qatar, which hosts the regional headquarters for U.S. Central Command, saw its aircraft numbers surge between January 17th and February 1st. Muwafaq Salti Air Base in Jordan showed a similar buildup, with at least a dozen F-15E Strike Eagles visible on the tarmac by late January. That's in addition to the permanent forces already stationed throughout the Middle East. Reports from U.S. defense officials suggest this buildup is different from last June. Back then, the strikes were designed as a one-off operation. The B-2 bombers flew in, dropped their payloads, and flew home. Iran responded with a symbolic missile strike on a U.S. base in Qatar that caused no casualties, because Tehran apparently warned Washington in advance. This time, according to sources who spoke to Reuters, the U.S. military is preparing for potentially weeks-long sustained operations. Not a single night of bombing, but an extended air campaign that could involve back-and-forth strikes and reprisals over an extended period. One official told Reuters that the United States fully expected Iran to retaliate, leading to what could become a genuine shooting war between the two nations. This is where things get really dangerous. Iran still has teeth. Despite the damage from Operation Midnight Hammer, despite the violent crackdown on protests draining resources, despite international sanctions strangling its economy, Iran retains significant military capabilities. The regime has spent the past 8 months since the June war frantically rebuilding. And here's what's crucial to understand: they haven't been prioritizing their nuclear program. Satellite imagery analyzed by the New York Times shows that Iran has focused on restoring its ballistic missile infrastructure. More than a dozen missile production and testing facilities have been repaired or rebuilt since the strikes. Some facilities were operational again within months. Why missiles instead of nuclear sites? Because missiles are Iran's primary deterrent right now. John Caves, a consultant at the U.S. National Defense University, explained it perfectly. Threatening Israel and U.S. bases and allies in the region with missile attacks is one of Iran's few options to deter repeat strikes on its nuclear facilities. Iran is believed to have thousands of missiles and drones within range of American troops stationed in countries across the Middle East. They've also threatened to close the Strait of Hormuz, the narrow waterway through which nearly 20% of the world's oil passes. Supreme Leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei delivered an ominous warning on February 9th. Americans must realize that if they ignite a war, this time it will not be a limited war but a regional war, and Iran wouldn't be fighting alone. The country leads what it calls the Axis of Resistance, a network of allied militias and groups across the Middle East. Lebanese Hezbollah, despite being battered in recent conflicts with Israel, retains significant military capabilities. The Houthi rebels in Yemen have already demonstrated their willingness and ability to attack shipping in the Red Sea and have warned they could resume such attacks. Iraqi militia groups have threatened the bitterest forms of death for American forces. All of these groups could attack U.S. interests if Washington strikes Iran, potentially triggering the regional war Khamenei warned about. This is what's keeping America's Arab allies up at night. Saudi Arabia's defense minister, Khalid bin Salman, reportedly expressed deep concerns during meetings in Washington that U.S. military action would likely be inconclusive and spark regional warfare. Yet he also reportedly told Washington think tank experts that if this doesn't happen, it will only embolden the regime. Qatar, Oman, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, and the UAE have all been working frantically to prevent a U.S.-Iran war, fearing it would devastate a region already reeling from decades of conflict. Several Gulf states have reportedly told Washington they don't want their bases used for strikes on Iran, though they have also been preparing to defend against Iranian retaliation just in case. Now, let's talk about what those satellites are seeing right now, because this is where the story gets truly alarming. Starting in late January, Planet Lab satellite imagery showed something new at the bombed Iranian nuclear facilities. Workers had constructed roofs over damaged buildings at both Isfahan and Natanz. These weren't repairs to make the facilities operational again. These were coverings specifically designed to block satellites from seeing what was happening on the ground. Andrea Stricker, who studies Iran for the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, explained what this likely means. They want to be able to get at any recovered assets they can get to without Israel or the United States seeing what survived. In other words, Iran is trying to assess what key assets, such as limited stocks of highly enriched uranium, might have survived the strikes and recover them in secret. But that's not all. At the Isfahan facility, something even more dramatic has been happening. The site has a hardened underground tunnel complex built into a nearby mountain. These tunnels were designed to protect critical nuclear equipment and possibly enriched uranium from aerial bombardment. In early February, new satellite imagery from the Institute for Science and International Security showed that Iran has been filling these tunnel entrances with massive amounts of dirt. Not just a little dirt, mountains of it. High-resolution imagery from February 10th shows that the middle and southern entrances are now unrecognizable, fully covered in soil. The northernmost entrance has also been backfilled. No vehicle activity is visible around any of the three entrances, indicating the work is complete and access has been blocked. This is the same defensive measure Iran took in the days just before Operation Midnight Hammer last June. Analysts believe it serves multiple purposes. Filling the tunnels with dirt would help dampen the shockwave from bunker buster bombs, potentially protecting whatever's inside. It also makes it much harder for special forces to raid the facility. The Institute for Science and International Security concluded, it appears clear that the Iranians are seriously concerned about a U.S. or Israeli aerial attack and or raid against this particularly hardened nuclear facility. Former British Army intelligence officer Dr. Lynette Nussbacher noted that it's certainly easier to clear tunnel entrances with bulldozers than to rebuild after a Tomahawk strike or massive ordnance penetrator turned sites into craters. There's another facility everyone's watching closely. About 2 kilometers south of the Natanz nuclear complex, there's a mountain the Iranians call Ku-e-Kolangazla, but Western analysts have nicknamed it Pickaxe Mountain. For years, Iran has been excavating a massive underground complex there. Recent satellite imagery from February 10th shows fresh concrete being laid on top of entrance areas. A boom pump used to deliver concrete is clearly visible. This facility wasn't struck during Operation Midnight Hammer, but it's believed to be Iran's backup plan, a new deeply buried enrichment facility designed to replace the ones that were destroyed. President Trump has acknowledged this new site. After the June strikes, he said that Iranian officials were thinking about starting a new site. The question is whether this new facility is already operational or still under construction. Either way, its existence demonstrates Iran's determination to preserve its nuclear program, no matter the cost. Every image from these satellites tells a story of a nation racing against time, trying to protect what remains of its nuclear infrastructure while building new capabilities that will be even harder to destroy. Now here's where diplomacy enters the picture, such as it is. Despite all the military preparations and threats, there have been actual negotiations. In early February, American and Iranian officials met in Oman for the first time since the June War. These talks were indirect, with Omani mediators shuttling between the two sides. The discussions focused on Iran's nuclear program. though the United States and Israel also want to address Iran's ballistic missiles and its support for militant groups across the region. Iran has flatly rejected expanding the talks beyond the nuclear issue. What exactly is Trump demanding? According to multiple reports, his conditions amount to what many observers have called a surrender. Iran must dismantle its nuclear program entirely. It must give up its ballistic missile arsenal. It must end support for its allied militias across the Middle East, groups like Hezbollah, the Houthis, and Iraqi militias that have been central to Iran's regional influence for decades. And it must stop executing dissidents arrested during the protests. These are maximalist demands that Tehran has categorically rejected. Iranian officials have said they're willing to discuss the level and purity of uranium enrichment, which is at least something. But Supreme Leader Khamenei, who holds ultimate authority in Iran's system, has been defiant. His regime has made clear that while it wants to avoid American military strikes, it will not accept terms that would effectively destroy Iran's regional power and domestic control. So we have parallel tracks running simultaneously, diplomacy that seems unlikely to succeed, and military preparations for a conflict that could dwarf anything we've seen in the region. Trump told Axios in an interview that either we will make a deal or we will have to do something very tough like last time. He said Iran wants to make a deal very badly and is engaging much more seriously than during previous talks because of the military threat. Last time they didn't believe I would do it, Trump said. They overplayed their hand. He's trying to use the same playbook that worked with North Korea during his first term. Maximum pressure, combined with the credible threat of devastating military action to force concessions. But Iran isn't North Korea. It's a much larger country with a much more developed military and a network of allies and proxies across one of the world's most strategically vital regions. And the Iranian regime, despite its current weakness, has survived worse crises than this. It survived the Iran-Iraq War in the 1980s, one of the bloodiest conflicts of the 20th century. It survived decades of international sanctions. It survived previous rounds of protests and unrest. The hardliners, who currently control Iran's security apparatus, believe they can survive this too, especially if it means maintaining the nuclear program they see as essential to the regime's survival and regional influence. There's also the question of what Trump really wants to achieve. During Operation Midnight Hammer, Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth was careful to say the mission was not about regime change. But Trump himself posted on Truth Social asking, why wouldn't there be a regime change, using the hashtag MIGA, Make Iran Great Again. Some reports suggest Israeli military intelligence has briefed U.S. officials on potential decapitation strikes targeting Iranian leaders, including Khamenei himself. Other reports mention lower-risk options like blockading Iran's shadow fleet of oil tankers or deploying special operations forces to raid nuclear and missile sites rather than a full-scale air campaign. But here's the brutal reality that military planners understand, even if politicians don't always acknowledge it. You can't bomb a country into democracy. You can destroy infrastructure, kill leaders, degrade military capabilities. But changing a regime requires either an internal revolution that succeeds, which the January massacres suggest the Iranian security forces are determined to prevent, or a massive ground invasion and occupation, which nobody wants, and which would make the Iraq War look like a minor skirmish by comparison. Iran has 3 times Iraq's population and 4 times its land area, much of it mountainous terrain perfect for defense. So what happens next? That's the question, keeping intelligence analysts, military planners, and diplomats awake at night. One Western source familiar with coordination talks between the U.S. and Israel told Iran International that military action is now virtually certain. Decision-making circles have moved past diplomacy and are now only debating timing. The source said the key question is no longer whether an attack will take place, but when an appropriate operational and political window will emerge. That window could open in the coming days or take shape over several weeks. What would such an attack look like? Based on the current military buildup and reported planning, it would be far more extensive than Operation Midnight Hammer. Instead of a single night of strikes, we're talking about a sustained air campaign potentially lasting weeks. The target list would likely include not just nuclear facilities, but missile production sites, missile storage bunkers, command and control centers, possibly even regime leadership targets. The goal would be to so thoroughly degrade Iran's military capabilities that the regime either collapses or is forced to accept whatever terms Washington dictates. But Iran has made clear it won't go quietly. The regime has deployed large numbers of heavily armed security personnel in major cities, ready to crush any internal uprising that American strikes might encourage. It has dispersed and hidden its most valuable military assets to make targeting more difficult. It has coordinated with its allied militias to prepare for retaliatory strikes across the region. And it has sent diplomatic messages through intermediaries warning that any U.S. attack will trigger a regional war that could spiral out of control. There are so many ways this could go catastrophically wrong. Iran could close or mine the Strait of Hormuz, sending global oil prices skyrocketing and potentially triggering a worldwide recession. Iranian missiles could kill significant numbers of American troops at bases across the Middle East, forcing the United States to escalate further. Hezbollah could launch thousands of rockets at Israel, opening a new front in the conflict. The Houthis could resume attacks on shipping in the Red Sea, further disrupting global trade. Iraqi militias could overrun American positions in Iraq. Any or all of these scenarios could happen, and once the shooting starts, it becomes incredibly difficult to control where it ends. Yet the counter-argument from hawks in Washington and Jerusalem is equally stark. If the United States doesn't act now, Iran will eventually acquire nuclear weapons. Once that happens, deterring Iran becomes exponentially more difficult, and the risk of nuclear proliferation across the Middle East increases dramatically. Saudi Arabia has made clear it would pursue its own nuclear program if Iran gets the bomb. So would Turkey, Egypt, possibly others. The nightmare scenario isn't just a nuclear Iran, it's a nuclear Middle East, where any of multiple conflicts could escalate to atomic warfare. From this perspective, the time to act is now, while Iran is weakened by protests and economic crisis, before it can rebuild its nuclear program in even deeper, more sophisticated facilities that might be truly impossible to destroy. We're watching this unfold in real time. Every satellite image, every diplomatic meeting, every carrier group deployment, every tunnel filled with dirt brings us closer to a moment of decision. The question isn't whether Iran's nuclear program poses a threat. It clearly does. The question isn't whether Iran's regime is brutal and repressive. The January massacres answered that beyond any doubt. The question is whether military action can solve this problem without creating even worse problems. And on that question, even the experts are deeply divided. What we know for certain is this: Iran is fortifying its facilities because it expects to be hit again. The United States is assembling military forces because it's preparing to hit them. Diplomacy continues because nobody really wants the war that seems to be coming. But the gap between what each side is willing to accept appears unbridgeable. Trump wants Iran's complete capitulation on nuclear weapons, missiles, and regional influence. Iran wants sanctions lifted and the freedom to maintain the programs it sees as essential to its security and power. Those positions are fundamentally incompatible. And so we wait and watch while satellites circle overhead, recording every movement, every preparation, every sign of what's coming next. The tunnels sealed with dirt at Isfahan, the concrete being poured at Pickaxe Mountain, the American warships gathering in the Gulf, the Iranian missiles hidden in underground bunkers, the protesters' graves still fresh in Iranian soil. All of it pointing toward a confrontation that could reshape the Middle East and send shockwaves through the global economy and international security for years to come. Let's talk about what makes this crisis different from all the others that have come before. The United States and Iran have been adversaries since the Islamic Revolution of 1979, when Iranian students stormed the American embassy in Tehran and held 52 Americans hostage for 444 days. That crisis ended Ronald Reagan's presidency before it even began, and set the template for 4 decades of hostility. But through all those decades, through all the threats and counter-threats, through proxy wars in Lebanon and Iraq and Yemen, through the assassinations and the sanctions and the covert operations, the two countries managed to avoid direct, sustained military conflict. Even during the T administration's first term, when tensions soared and General Qasem Soleimani was killed by an American drone strike at Baghdad airport in January 2020, the confrontation stayed contained. Iran responded with ballistic missile strikes on U.S. bases in Iraq that injured over 100 American service members but killed none. Both sides pulled back from the brink. The unwritten rules held: don't kill each other's people in large numbers. Don't attack each other's territory directly. Keep the conflict manageable, controllable, survivable. Operation Midnight Hammer broke those rules. For the first time since 1988, American aircraft attacked Iranian soil, not Iranian proxies, not Iranian forces in a third country. Iran itself. The strikes destroyed facilities that Iran had spent billions of dollars and decades building. They represented years of scientific work going up in smoke and flame. And while the United States tried to frame it as limited strikes focused on nuclear facilities, the message was unmistakable. We can reach you anywhere. We can destroy anything we choose. And there's nothing you can do to stop us. Iran's response last June was remarkably restrained, precisely because the regime understood how completely outmatched it was. They fired missiles at a U.S. base in Qatar, but apparently warned Washington in advance so that personnel could take cover. It was a face-saving gesture, a way to claim they'd retaliated without actually triggering the full-scale war they knew they would lose. But that was June. This is February. And everything has changed. The internal situation in Iran is far more volatile now than it was 8 months ago. The regime has just massacred thousands of its own citizens. The economy is in freefall. The government's legitimacy has been shattered by the violence of its crackdown. This puts the Iranian regime in an impossible bind. If they appear weak, they risk encouraging more protests. But if they retaliate forcefully against American strikes, they risk a war that would devastate what's left of Iran's economy. Consider also the broader geopolitical context. This isn't happening in isolation. Russia is bogged down in Ukraine and can't offer Iran the support it might have provided in different circumstances. China is dealing with its own economic challenges. Iran's traditional allies are either weakened or focused on their own interests. Iran is more isolated now than at any point in recent memory. And yet, isolation can make a cornered regime more dangerous, not less. When your back is against the wall, when you believe the enemy is coming for you regardless of what you do, the calculation changes. Rational deterrence assumes both sides want to avoid catastrophic outcomes. But what if the Iranian regime concludes that catastrophe is coming anyway? There's also the question of what happens after the strikes. Assume the United States successfully destroys every nuclear facility it can identify, every missile production plant, every command center. What then? History suggests the Iranian regime won't collapse. It survived the Iran-Iraq War, which killed hundreds of thousands. It survived the Green Revolution protests of 2009, crippling sanctions, and the Mahsa Amini protests. This is a regime that has shown remarkable resilience. If the regime doesn't collapse, you're left with an Iran that's even more hostile, even more determined to acquire nuclear weapons, and even more willing to use terrorism and proxy warfare against American interests. The history of American military interventions in the Middle East, from Iraq to Libya to Syria, suggests that it's easier to break things than to fix what comes after. But the counterargument can't be dismissed. Every day that Iran continues enriching uranium is a day closer to a nuclear weapon. There's a window of opportunity, and that window may be closing. If the United States doesn't act now, while Iran is weakened and vulnerable, the next opportunity might not come until after Iran has crossed the nuclear threshold. This brings us to Israel's role. It was Israel that launched the initial strikes in June 2025. It's Israel that has the most to fear from a nuclear Iran. And it's Israel that has shown willingness to act unilaterally when it believes its existence is threatened. If Israel gets directly involved in any new round of strikes, the scale would expand dramatically. The coordination between Washington and Jerusalem is close, but that doesn't mean their interests are identical. The role of America's Gulf Arab allies adds another layer. These countries host American military bases, but also have to live in the neighborhood with Iran long after American attention moves elsewhere. They've seen what happened in Iraq and Afghanistan. They're understandably nervous about becoming collateral damage. Some have reportedly told Washington they don't want their bases used for strikes on Iran. Yet these same countries also fear Iranian hegemony. They want Iran contained and weakened, but not in a way that triggers regional conflagration. Then there's the economic dimension. The Strait of Hormuz carries approximately 20% of the world's oil supply. Any serious disruption would send energy prices soaring globally. We're talking about potential oil shocks that could trigger recessions worldwide. The global economy is still recovering from COVID and subsequent inflation. Iran knows this is one of their few sources of leverage. This is why some analysts have suggested lower risk options like blockading Iran's oil exports using naval forces rather than airstrikes. Such an approach would put economic pressure on the regime while avoiding the immediate escalation that bombing would trigger. But it would also be an act of war, just a different kind. The nuclear question itself is more complex than simple narratives suggest. Yes, Iran has enriched significant quantities of uranium. Yes, they have the knowledge and industrial capacity to build nuclear weapons if they choose. But weaponization is harder than just having enriched uranium. You need to design and test a warhead small enough to fit on a missile. Intelligence assessments suggest Iran hasn't completed these steps, though they've done research that brings them closer. The question isn't just whether Iran can build a bomb, it's whether they will and when and under what circumstances. Some analysts argue that Iran's strategy has always been to maintain the capability to build nuclear weapons quickly if needed, while stopping short of actually building them. Others argue that the regime has made a strategic decision to acquire nuclear weapons and is just waiting for the right moment. This uncertainty is part of what makes the crisis so dangerous. Where does this leave us? Caught between an immovable object and an unstoppable force. Iran will not voluntarily give up its nuclear program, its missiles, and its regional influence. The United States will not accept a nuclear Iran. Diplomacy offers a way out only if one side or both sides is willing to compromise in ways they've shown no sign of accepting. Military action offers a way to destroy Iran's current nuclear facilities, but no guarantee of lasting success and enormous risks of escalation. The satellite images tell us that both sides are preparing for war, while still talking about peace. That's not necessarily contradictory. Throughout history, nations have negotiated while simultaneously preparing for conflict. The preparations don't make war inevitable, but they make it possible. They move the pieces into position. They create the infrastructure for violence. And once that infrastructure exists, once the forces are assembled and the plans are made and the political rhetoric reaches a certain pitch, it becomes harder to step back. The humanitarian costs of any conflict would be staggering. The January massacres already killed thousands of Iranian protesters. A sustained military campaign could kill tens of thousands more, both military personnel and civilians. American service members would be in harm's way across multiple countries. The economic shockwaves could trigger recessions globally. And if the conflict spirals into the regional war Iran is threatened, the consequences become almost impossible to predict. Yet the alternative argument can't be dismissed. If Iran acquires nuclear weapons, it changes the calculus of every conflict in the Middle East. If nuclear proliferation spreads to Saudi Arabia, Turkey, Egypt, and other regional powers in response, the risk of catastrophic war increases exponentially. The choice isn't between action and safety, it's between different types of risk, different potential catastrophes. The fuse is lit. Whether it reaches the powder keg depends on decisions that will be made in Washington, Tehran, Jerusalem, and capitals across the Middle East in the coming days and weeks. The massive movement at nuclear sites that satellites have spotted, the tunnels being sealed, the concrete being poured, the military hardware being positioned, all of it suggests that the moment of decision is approaching. Trump has said Iran must make a deal or face something very traumatic. Iran has said any attack will trigger regional war. Both sides have drawn red lines. The question is whether anyone will blink before those lines are crossed. The world is watching, the satellites are recording, and the clock is ticking toward a confrontation that could define the Middle East for a generation.